Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 20th of February. I'll start with the 7-day roundup of the coronavirus statistics for Scotland. So as at 2 o'clock on Friday, in the past 7 days, there had been 45,889 new COVID cases recorded. Since last Sunday, there have been sadly 70 newly reported deaths of people who have been coronavirus positive tested 28 days before. 4,430,717 people have received their first dose of the COVID vaccine, 4,148,237 their second dose, and 3,377,893 have received a third dose or booster jab. As of the 18th of February, there have been a total of 1,333 cases, 332 in Scotland. 960 people were in hospital on Friday with recently confirmed COVID-19, 10 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 10,582 patients who've tested positive for coronavirus have sadly died. I'm joined this afternoon by Bella Caledonia editor Mike Small and former MSP and presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, Linda Fabiani. Welcome to you both. We're going to start the show with the Ukraine and Putin, but I want to take a slightly different slant on it today. I'm a bit fed up hearing that Putin's about to invade. Yes, he is. No, he's not. It's almost like a pantomime. I want to dig a bit deeper today. And I want to look at what's really going on in the wider geopolitical sphere and what are we missing that Putin is doing while we're so focused on might this be a war? I mean, I think Putin is pretty well understood to be extremely manipulative, extremely shrewd, and a control freak in some respects. He's got bigger fish to fry, I think, than just the Ukraine. So, Mike, if you were a betting man, what would you say is really behind this latest build-up of troops? Will he invade, will he not, is almost not important. What else is going on?
Well, obviously there's the energy crisis and gas pipelines that are crucial for the Russian economy. I think that's definitely going. In a way, there's a paradox because Russia isn't a democracy, and so Putin has to play to an audience, but that's not crucial for him. So I think he does feel that NATO is being aggressive, which it is. But I'm also slightly tired of the narrative, which is sort of almost pro-Putin or saying that he's not being aggressive. He clearly is. He clearly is, and it's an authoritarian regime. I think that there's an odd thing going on sometimes with people on the left who kind of view this as a binary between the West and Russia, and then favour Russia, which I don't think is a regime that you can really support in any way if you're a progressive or radical person or a person of the left. It doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. I suspect he will invade. I suspect it will get very bloody, and I'm not feeling very optimistic about that scenario at all.
There's a suggestion that his inner circle has changed over the last few years. It was at one time dominated by oligarchs, people who were really concerned about the economy. The Russian economy is not doing very well at the moment, but then whose economy is? But it appears that he's kind of changed from that inner circle, and now his inner circle are very solidly defence specialists, and that they're the ones that put things on his desk and tell him what to do. I think, Linda, one of the things that concerns me is there are troops now, Russian troops now in Belarus. Now, for years, Lukashenko said he wouldn't allow that, but for various reasons he has done. And it's just been announced today that these troops are not intending to leave. So we're now in a position where there's been a bit of a land grab, almost under the noses of the West that no one's really seen. And we now have Russian troops piling up in a country adjacent to NATO allies in the Baltic states. Surely that has to be a worry. So is what he's about really these kind of mini land grabs more than this big, if you like, a winner-takes-all invasion of the Ukraine?
I think there's a lot of things that Putin is about, and I think the fundamental thing that we should all bear in mind is what Mike was saying. This is an authoritarian regime. It's not a regime that I think can be in any way excused. I also think it's quite shameful the way that Western countries have embraced some of that stuff, by the money that has come in through their economies, as, London, for example, being the financial capital. Yeah, let's look at where the money's coming from. Let's look at some of the corruption. So there's an awful lot in there. There's a basis for Putin, which is about holding on to power. Because if he was to lose power, who knows what would happen to him? So I think there's a very personal thing going on here. And these folk like him, will do anything to maintain. So I think that there is an element of chaos going on here that is absolutely deliberate, because it's in order to get out of a situation, if you create chaos, you can do other things. So when you look at what's happening and all the rhetoric that he feels is building him up with his own population, this tough guy stuff, sitting in the horse, bare chested, oh my goodness, all that nonsense. There's also this chaos going on, and everyone's focused on Ukraine, and you're absolutely right. Meanwhile, we've got Belarus going on, and all the different things around about that region. So if there's so much happening, things just get reported as they happen, and nobody's looking behind and seeing the pattern. So I think that's quite a deliberate thing. And yes, what's happening in Belarus is very worrying, and it may well be that we will see a change of regime in Belarus very soon. But then you have to look at the effect that has on neighbouring countries in Eastern Europe in general. And so there's a lot of terribly concerning things going on.
Mike, Linda's made that point that, chaos is something that kind of follows Putin. He deliberately creates chaos. That's his modus operandi, and there's a pattern to it. One of the other things he likes to do is divide and rule. So he's been very, very adept at turning the EU against the US. We know that he's had a huge interference in a number of elections, not least the United States presidential elections, Brexit. He's helped turn, therefore, UK against the EU. And there's now a suggestion that because sanctions are really the only thing that are definitely on the table, because no Western power has said they'll actually send troops in, and it's not a boots on the ground scenario. It's discussing sanctions. The most latest is that there should be able to stop Russia using the dollar or the pound in terms of international trade, although that's not definite. But there's a suggestion that within the EU, and if we include Britain in terms of the wider Europe, that there's a bit of disagreement about how strong these sanctions can be. Now, that's clearly because this Russian money has been so important to the economy. And so it seems like he's trying to drive a very subtle wedge through there. So it's not really fair to say, is there, that there's a united front against Putin?
Possibly not. And I think what we're seeing as well is a kind of post-Brexit Britain, what's our role and status in the world. And it's one that's completely isolated. You see Liz going over to Moscow and being completed because he was frankly completely representing an isolated country. She had no strategy, she had no diplomacy, they didn't really have anything to say. She just had a series of lines that she repeated, condemning, and she looked extremely foolish. So I don't think that's a case that they're trying to separate Europe and Britain, because that's already happened. But I do think that's the case that if you look at Macron and you look at France, when they go to negotiate, they go kind of semblance of authority and credibility, a kind of diplomatic plan in place. So it's more like being grown-ups in the room with Russia. I don't know how much you can appease him, but at least they are negotiating, credible countries. And I think very much this exposes Britain as a sort of post-Brexit isolated nation that has really lost a lot of its power and authority.
What I was getting at, though, is there's a suggestion, for example, that France have got a different view on what the economic sanctions should be against Russia than, say, Germany, who are maybe not quite as strident. So I think within the 27 existing member states of the EU, there's a bit of division. Linda, there's not much being said about how the Baltic states might be feeling about all this. They must be getting increasingly nervous and worried, do you think?
Oh, they absolutely must be, all around that region. If you look at like Latvia and Do you know, I've completely forgotten the name of the country. Estonia, Estonia, Lithuania.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, all around that region, countries which have embraced the idea of European unity and the European Union, and are now looking at it and thinking, oh, what's going on here? I mean, there are issues within the European Union, of course there are, Maggie, as you say, but at least they're talking, you know, they're talking to each other. And that is so incredibly important. And Britain is isolated. I mean, Britain just doesn't matter anymore. They think they're still part of this strategic game that goes on. No, they're not. They're humoured by the US because we're useful in some regards. But the main players here are the United States and the European Union. And yes, the Baltic states must be really, really worried. I mean, we all know, you know, some of the rise of authoritarianism in some of the Eastern European countries that's going on alongside Putin as well. So when you put all these things into the mix, ordinary people must be full of trepidation about what their future's bringing for them and their children.
And obviously, Mike, it's kind of trickling. News is trickling out, I think. But the Russian-controlled areas of the Ukraine, there's now quite a bit of resurgence happening there. I mean, there have been Ukrainian soldiers have been shot and killed as a result of their movements in the last couple of days. So I'm wondering if that's really where the attack is going to come from, if you like, and then Putin will move in to say that he's defending. It's what he did in the Crimea. He's defending the Russians who live in that part of the Ukraine. It's like he's trying to get other people to fight his battles for him in a bit. Typical bully, I suppose.
Yeah, there's kind of two schools of thought, isn't there? There's one that he might make a play on the Donbass region and go into the kind of more Russian supportive enclaves, or that they might make a full out assault and try and take the capital Kiev and replace the government there. And you know there has been leaks of plans for assassinations and to put a puppet government in. It's very difficult to tell from here, but I think it's not looking positive. And the idea last week that he was withdrawing troops and that it was all going to be a peaceful settlement looks increasingly unlikely.
Yeah, his propaganda machine is better than anybody else's propaganda machine. Public opinion at home is claiming that 50% of Russians think all of this is the fault of Russia, of the United States, and 17% of Russians think it's all the fault of the Ukraine. So he doesn't necessarily need public opinion because he is an autocratic leader, but he does seem to have public opinion behind him. When I was talking about sort of splits within the EU, something else has just happened this week, which makes me think, is this another area where Putin seems to want areas of influence? That's his. He starts with areas of political influence, and then it gets stronger. So just this week, the EU have announced internal financial sanctions against Hungary and Poland because they're not sticking to the rule of law that's required in the EU, and that their values along certain areas, the persecution of minorities, for example, the fact that the courts in Poland are no longer totally independent. Now, Hungary for a long time has been buddying up to Russia. We know that. They've been, in conversations with Russia, with Putin, asking for support and help. And you just wonder, if there was to be some sort of split or some sort of cooling off of relations from these two former Soviet states, is it likely that either of them, Hungary in particular, I think, starts to look to the Soviet bloc or the former Soviet bloc as its natural home rather than the EU? And is that something that, again, is credible, we should be concerned about? Is that a likely scenario? What do you think, Linda?
Oh gosh, Maggie, I don't know. I mean, I have to be honest and say I don't know. I don't know enough about public opinion in the likes of Hungary. I know a wee bit more about Poland. What I do know is that there's been the right wing drift in these countries that we're seeing generally across the globe so often. Is there still enough democracy in these countries to stop that kind of thing? I want to be positive about this and say, yes, I believe there are. I mean, these countries always had a very strong democratic leaning amongst those within the country who always campaigned, who always protested. So I would hope that having some degree of freedom, if you like to use the word, freedom of expression, except for freedom of movement within the EU, has done enough that there would be, just no truck with the idea of going back to the kind of repressive regime that the Soviet Union was.
Because there has been, Mike, a lot of people have suggested that Hungary in particular should kind of be asked to leave the EU simply because it's flouting a lot of EU law and its values are not that really of the rest of the bloc. But I think I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. But this would be something to consider, wouldn't it? If that were to happen, or if Hungary feel they're being pushed, it may be that they think they've got a home somewhere else, and maybe that is something we should be worried about, or have I just gone down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories?
I don't know. I think Hungary's a very different proposition than Poland, and it may well be that they come under the influence of Russia more because of the alliance of kind of authoritarianism. But the Russian economy is in deep, and I don't think that it has a lot for in terms of assets in that sense. So my feeling is that the EU is still a much more popular marketplace for those countries to be part of, and there is that kind of tension between either the authoritarianism of Hungary or sort of radical conservatism of Poland, and how much the EU impose values on its member states. So, I mean, this is part of the kind of rolling debate that we see. We're going to have the French presidential elections coming up. Kind of the visions of Europe for the future aren't just confined to Britain. Are a live debate about how they perceive that conflict.
No, I think you may have frozen there, Mike. Yeah, well, there have been lots of challenges that Europe has faced in the last 50 years or so, but I think in some ways this is one of the biggest. Is will they hold together in a unified form? Will there be any splits? And are they going to have a credible answer to what Putin is trying to do? We should remind ourselves they had no credible answer when Putin annexed the Crimea 8 years ago. Coming back closer to home then, and Partygate. So Johnson handed in his questionnaire apparently on Friday in time. Of course, 50 questionnaires being sent to 50 people is very different from 50 people sitting in an interview room being questioned about their actions. 50 questionnaires being sent to people over a period of time could allow collusion if they were that way inclined, although I believe the Met asked them very nicely not to collude. But is it credible, do you think, Linda, that they were on the phone to one another asking, what are you putting down for question number 1?
Ah, man. Do you know, I find it all just stunning. Yeah, these questionnaires have gone out, they've also had access to the, elements of the Sudbury report, etc. So now filling in these questionnaires. So there's a thought of what they have already said. Is there anything that, in the light of what's come out, they want to change a wee bit, move around a wee bit? And have they been speaking to some of their pals? Has there been the gossip going on? Sharing information? I just find the whole thing, I'm incredulous about it all. And I think what I'm most incredulous about is the sort of special way that these folks have been treated. As you start off with the fact that you've got the police in 10 Downing Street basically told turn a blind eye to any law breaking that goes on here. And then you move from that to the very special way that folk have been treated in relation to the potential breaking of the law, and the way they get to fill in the questionnaires and all the information that's out there. I just don't think it can be taken that seriously, Maggie.
No, I'm not.
Very sad for democracy.
I'm not sure. I don't know if you know this, Mike. No reason why you necessarily should know it. I don't know how familiar you are with the Met's procedures, but I don't know if the use of these questionnaires for this kind of breach of the law is common or not. I'd never heard about it before, but then no reason that I should do. But it does seem slightly strange. But perhaps what's more strange is the police have said, now they may have changed their mind, but they definitely came out and said a week ago that they would report how many people were fined and what the nature of the fines were, but they would not report who had been fined. But surely, Mike, that information is not just in the public interest. Surely it must be in the public domain somewhere. Can the police keep that hidden?
Well, I think they can. I mean, it is extraordinary exceptionalism what we're seeing here. And if you think about it, a week and a half ago, it was kind of like the high point of Partygate, and people were speculating that he would have to go. He's rode this out. He came to Scotland last week, almost just like sort of rubbing Ross's nose in it and saying, "I'm going to come up here. There's nothing you can do." He will appear at the Scottish Tory Party conference. He's going to survive this. And I think what it shows us is not just that the Met is operating in a highly political way, but that there seems to be these characters can act with complete immunity. There doesn't seem to be a threshold of behaviour or action that people in Britain can go beyond that has any consequence. So it is funny to watch that. Everybody absolutely convinced that his behaviour was so disgraceful and so unorthodox and so unprecedented that he would be forced to resign because this was, conduct in public office was so appalling. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. I mean, I wrote earlier this week, the British state is irredeemable. There's no consequence. And you can see this. It's mirrored with Prince Andrew. Nothing will happen.
I mean, I can remember when Trump was elected and everyone said he won't last a year. Look at all the awful things he's done. Look at the terrible things he's said. Look at all the evidence. And I kept saying, do you know what? He's going to last, because you're right. He's almost untouchable in a way. And the people who are in the position of making a difference to whether a politician can last or not, it's not almost in their interest. I was wondering, Linda, that great old science and physics question that says, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? I'm wondering if now what we've got is, if a Tory Prime Minister is found guilty but it's not made public, does that mean Tory backbenchers can just ignore it?
See, what Mike was saying about the British state being broken and these people just seem to act with impunity. One of the things I also find appalling about it relates to what you've just said with that analogy, which is you've got all these people, backbenchers, etc., prominent Tory party members, and indeed other UK politicians of different persuasions who are not saying anything, who just accept this as this is the way it's happening. And I've always said, when I was a politician, and I actually believe myself, if you like, when I say this, I had red lines. And I was always very, very conscious and grateful that none of my red lines were crossed by the party that I was privileged to represent in a very privileged position. But there were certain things that if my party, the SNP, had done in government, I would have had to go. And one of them would have been a leader who is acting so very badly, because it's not just Partygate, it's all the other things like prologue in Parliament, lying in the chamber, all these different things. That would have been a red line for me. I would have had to go. So I am as appalled by those who sit silent. And we all know many, many sayings about evil can just get worse and worse. When I can't remember the exact quote, when good men say nothing, I think was part of it. And I think that's what we're seeing now. So you've got that, and then you've got the likes of, I'm still appalled by that Tory MP whose name I have chosen to forget, who quite casually walked across the floor and joined the Labour Party because his potential re-election is in danger. But I'm as appalled by a Labour Party who, looking at that man's record, said, welcome. And that's what's broken. It's the establishment, which is UK in terms of politics, is wide open and everyone can now see it. It's about taking turns and having your shot and ranting and raving for a while, but actually biting your lip with important things, because that might rock the boat just that bit too much. So I am as appalled by those who sit and say nothing as I am by those who are carrying out what
I know we're going to talk about the media a bit later in the programme, Mike, but there's also this issue. So we're not hearing backbenchers saying the opposition are making the right noises, but there's simply not enough of them to make any difference. It will take a backbench rebellion within the party to get rid of him or to force through any kind of change. But we're not even really hearing public opinion, because public opinion is manipulated by the media. So the old joke that, the media is there to represent and reflect public opinion, those of us who've had a history in journalism know that that's just not true, that actually it's about manipulating public opinion. So we're not even hearing public opinion. I mean, we did hear the Tory press get a bit upset and a bit hot under the collar for a few days, but that's gone away. They've now exactly leapt onto this kind of Boris Johnson, the Churchillian, coming out and making statements. So the Ukrainian crisis is the worst since 1945. I was very struck, for example, by Boris Johnson's comments from Munich, suggesting that Munich was the last gasp hotel. And I'm thinking, there was another British Prime Minister who had a sort of a relationship with Munich like that. And is Boris Johnson going to come back with a piece of paper and wave it in our faces? So, if public opinion isn't getting heard, is Linda right to say, and you've suggested it earlier, that the British state is beyond redemption? Is it the case that the parliamentary system, the Westminster parliamentary system, is completely broken, has no moral authority anymore?
Yeah, I think it has moral authority as a government, and I don't think it has any constitutional checks and balances. I mean, if you look at it, we are beholden to the Tory MPs to eject him. There is no other mechanism other than a general election. There's no constitutional method that you can remove somebody who's clearly corrupt and lying, in America, for example. So it's lost moral authority, but it's constitutionally exposed. So we know, for example, that there's only 7 Tory MPs who put a letter into the 1922 committee. 17 out of, I'm not sure how many there are. There's over 300 Tory MPs, so 17 of them were that bothered. Most of them weren't really. We have to look to their kind of moral compass, and that's not a very great prospect for us.
Yeah. And do you think even if he is found guilty and it becomes public and he's fined, do you think any more Tory MPs will decide then to write the letter, or has this moment passed and he's survived this crisis?
I think he survived it. I think he's there. I think people have moved on. Don't think people are that bothered anymore. And the problem with it is it's also exhausting, because this kind of level of corruption and poor conduct in public office just gets normalised, because it's a kind of torrent of one thing after another. So it just becomes like the kind of surround sound of our public lives. And I think our threshold gets lowered and lowered, and people just get exhausted by it.
And Linda, as a former parliamentarian, you must be disappointed, but this just feeds into people's oft announced attitude that, politicians are all the same, they're all corrupt, there's no point. And that affects the democratic process as well, because people just don't want to engage with politics.
Yeah, and we talked about Putin earlier with his chaos theory. Johnson does the same thing. How many things are slipping through the net while all this is going on? I mean, they just lurch from one thing to another, and the raison d'etre seems to be to get through the next thing and to heck with the consequences and everything else. And yes, it sickens people, absolutely sickens people. And I think that's a deliberate ploy.
It is, yeah.
If people just say, oh, what's the point? I mean, I used to hear it in the doorsteps all the time when I was campaigning. Oh, you're all the same. And I would always challenge it, because I actually quite like talking to folk. And generally ended up with a very reasonable conversation, because the vast majority of people are very, very reasonable. But what they're trying to do is get people to that point where they won't even say that sort of thing. They'll just say, I'm not interested, and shut the door, because that suits them. And if you look at that and then look at the electoral laws they're putting through as well, and tie all these things together, it's a deliberate disenfranchisement of a lot of people.
A week ago, or just over a week ago, a leading congresswoman said that she thought democracy would be dead in the States within 10 years. Do you think we're in a similar position here? And I'm talking about the UK context, not any constitutional change in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at some of the legislation that's going through Parliament at the moment, the criminalisation of protest, civil liberties are under direct assault from some of this legislation. There's almost like pre-crime So people are going to a protest can be arrested. The increase in stop and search without any permission. You can see those are key hallmarks of democracy that are being undermined. If you look at the spy cops case that's been unfolding, extraordinary assault on civil liberties, secret policemen having relationships with peaceful environmental protesters, often having children with people. I mean, it's incredible what they've done, and it doesn't really get as much attention as it should. So I think that the growth of the surveillance state and the criminalisation of protest is a massive attack on democracy. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that people are concerned about, if they're not concerned about politics, is the continual squeeze on the cost of living. And as we know, that's been driven quite heavily by the huge increases in energy charges that are about to hit people in the UK. And that may become much worse if the Ukrainian situation escalates, although Britain doesn't rely on the new pipeline for its oil or gas. There's real concern that would have a knock-on effect. The SNP have raised the part in Parliament, or they will do when they go back next week, that EU partners, EU neighbours are doing a different thing about energy prices, that they're actually taking mitigating action. France has introduced a cap on prices. In Spain, there has been a targeted VAT cut. In Portugal, there have been reductions in tariffs for both for businesses and for individuals. Of course, nothing's happening in the UK like that. We're going to get £200 off our bill that we have to pay back. Really, the government are taking a very typical capitalist, laissez-faire attitude to it. Linda, the cost of living increase is really becoming now quite a major concern for people. And we were faced with the rather obscene picture of Douglas Ross, leader of the Scottish Tories, working at a soup kitchen this week while defending these cuts and these increases in prices. What should have been the response of the people that he was speaking to that night?
Should have ducked his head in the soup, as far as I'm concerned, Maggie. I just, mind you, that was a regular soup. I was just aghast when I saw that. Absolutely aghast. And actually, I have a problem with any politician, turning up to food kitchens and all that kind of thing and getting photographs and stuff. It can, some people do it absolutely genuinely. And, but I think you have to be very sensitive about it. That was just a very, very blatant look at me, the nice Tory. And I'm just aghast that why they thought that was acceptable. They have caused this. I mean, it's not that long ago that a soup kitchen was a soup kitchen. It was, for the very few people who, for whatever reason, something had hit in their life and their lifestyle was such that they weren't getting food. And you had, usually, vast majority of times, volunteers going out to make sure somebody got something hot and decent in their stomach. We're way past that now. Food banks have become part of the welfare state. And we have a government in the UK which takes, I am absolutely convinced, takes food banks into account when they decide benefits, etc. And they have put that burden on people that it's a normal thing. And that is absolutely appalling. And it's the Tories that have done this. And then you have the Tory leader in Scotland going out saying, I'll go out and do a wee bit of volunteering and help, but take my photo, will you? Because actually I'm a really nice guy. No, you're not. You're an absolute horror. And you're part of it, and you're allowing it to happen. So I'm just disgusted by it. And
I've always been surprised when politicians of any party have used visiting food banks or soup kitchens as a photo opportunity, because if you're the party who's created these things, then you should be damn right ashamed and go nowhere near. And if you're in party of opposition, you should be doing everything you can to make sure these things don't continue to exist. I think Linda is right, Mike, that they've become so normalised that people just assume they're there as another safety net. Do you think we'll ever get to a time when food banks become a thing of the past, or at least very, very unique, not this kind of almost popular thing that they've become, that people just now accept them, that their food banks are there.
Yeah, the growth has been incredible and it has become normalized. And, you think nothing of being in a supermarket and there's a shelf for donating food, and the statistics on it are ordinary. I think the £20 cut in universal credit that went through, the heating bills, the energy price rises is phenomenal. And as you say, there are other countries in Europe that are responding to this differently. I think there's a real threat for the Tories that if that cost of living crisis accelerates as people think it is, that people get, turn on them because that is so punitive, and they're, Douglas Ross's response is indicative of wider Tory contempt for ordinary people. And I think you see that those levels of kind of deep poverty really crossing through society in a way that is affecting more and more people. So that could be politically dangerous. I'd like to think that there was a alternative, and I'd like to see it in Scotland as well as at a UK level, of people really saying this isn't acceptable. And I think they only get away with it because Starmer's Labour Party is so ineffectual. They bumped up the polls last week, and that poll's kind of like eroded again. But I think that you need to have political movements and parties that are really saying this is unacceptable and making a case for an alternative, and I don't really see that yet.
Yeah. So you think the SNP are very good in Westminster making the case that it's unacceptable, but are you saying there's not a strong enough case being made about how that would be different, or how it could be different, or how it should be different?
Well, indeed. I mean, I think that we don't have the public energy utility that we were promised. Where is that? Where is the options for reducing energy output, really radically overhauling people's homes? Where is that? That seems to be absent. So it's quite right to deplore the Tories and condemn them, but where are the alternative political movements, and where are the alternative institutions and structures put in place in Scotland? I think that's absent.
And is it enough? I mean, whenever the SNP make comments about this sort of thing, their press releases always end with the same line that we'll only get out of this when we're an independent country. Linda, is that enough to say that, or is there not enough of a roadmap for people yet for them to believe that that's the case? We talked earlier about people become used to things. They become used to the fact that politicians are corrupt and can't be trusted. I'm not saying that people should ever get used to being hungry and not being able to heat their homes, but for people who are not as badly off as that and who see that as something happening to other people, are they becoming just used to it and therefore don't think there's any possibility of change?
I certainly think, and can I preface this by saying this is absolutely not an excuse, but it is an element, right? That there has been work going on. Pre-pandemic, there was work going on about basic income, potential pilot and all this kind of thing going on. I don't know the ins and outs of what happened about promised nationalised energy stuff. I really don't. I've not been part of that discussion, and I will admit quite openly that I tried to read into it, and I'm not really understanding what the big issues were, I have to say. I don't think SNP, as a government and indeed as a party, have been saying enough. Or maybe I can couch that by saying have been getting reported enough about what they're saying about the likes of food banks. Because there is an issue about an awful lot gets said and never gets reported. And, that's another discussion, is about the press and the media, or the mainstream press and media. So I think there probably is more that could be done. I would like to see more discussion about the guaranteed income. Wales made an announcement during the week for looked after children, for example, and I understand that the First Minister is talking to Mark Bakeford about the potential of that for Scotland. I do think we would have been further down the road with a roadmap, to use the term, had we not been hit with a pandemic. I do hope that at party level, if there's not been the time at government level to be doing all this work, a lot of this has been ongoing. I'm not in the executive party or anything, I can't talk about it with any authority.
Okay. Well, just to put all of this in the contempt that the Tories are showing the people of Britain into context, while they're not doing very much to mitigate the cost of living increases, they have just announced a tax cut for banks worth $4 billion. And just this week, there has been a cabinet revolt. Oh, about something important. You think, well, no, actually, they've decided that they're not going to go ahead with the ban on the import of fur or the import of foie gras. Jacob Rees-Mogg was apparently the cabinet minister who was most upset at that. Just to put that in context, I checked this morning, a kilogram of goose foie gras, and for those of you who are not familiar with your foie gras, goose foie gras is more luxurious than duck foie gras, is a £260 per kilo. A single person under the age of 25 in the UK gets £265 a month on universal credit. We're going to turn now to another story that's been breaking this week, and that is, it's not a new story, it's something that we've been discussed on this programme before, and that is online abuse, especially of women in the public eye. What's particularly triggered this has been the statement from Sarah Smith, the former BBC Scotland editor, who's now BBC editor in the United States, claiming that she's happier to be living in America because she'll not be getting the sort of vitriolic abuse that she received at the hands of people who didn't like her reporting. Now, abuse against women is always unacceptable. There are no ifs and there are no buts. Linda, I guess you know quite a lot about online abuse. You, I think, were subject to quite a lot of that while you were representing people. What's your view of what Sarah Smith has had to say and what should happen to stop this kind of abuse continuing, especially on social media?
There's a few issues here that I think have to be separated out. There's the first issue about journalism, mainstream journalism, the BBC, and indeed bias, real or apparent. Right? That's one issue. Regardless of any of that, there's the issue about whether American politics is going to be cleaner and less stressful than Scottish politics. I mean, even Andrew Neil in the Mail Online, I read this morning, was saying, oh, come on, American politics, and let's face it, if you are prominent as a reporter in American politics, I believe you would get an awful lot of abuse, and I also believe it'd be quite scary because of the kind of society that is. So then we get on to the issue of online abuse. None of what I have said, not one bit of what I have said, justifies the kind of abuse that journalists, politicians, anyone gets, particularly women for whom it is an awful lot worse. Now, I have had a wee bit of it, but it's minimal compared to what the likes of Nicola Sturgeon has had and what other people have had. It's absolutely unacceptable. Some of it's vile, and there's an absolute misogynist, sexist slant to what comes at women. We also have to bear in mind, actually, if you look at Twitter, which is where most of it happens, or maybe it happens on other platforms, I don't know about other platforms, I stopped at Twitter. But it's a small percentage of the population that actually pays any heed to any of that. It's a really interesting article by Kevin McKenna yesterday in the Herald talking about that, and it's probably less than 20% of people are actually on Twitter. But it gets reported as if it's a mainstream and big massive thing, and I don't actually think that helps. I often feel that responding to some of that stuff in the way that press respond to it, as if it's every day, as if it's happening in every part of our society, actually can make it worse because it gives these people a voice and makes them feel important. We have to do stuff about it. We have to call it out. But the likes of the big companies, they have to be looked at as well. I have real issues about some of the anonymous abuse that people get. Now, I understand there's times when somebody can't be, because of their job or whatever else, completely upfront about who they are when they have a Twitter account. But I don't believe that these kind of issues can't be overcome, and that the majority of people who are putting opinions on these sites should be obliged to be upfront about who they are. because most of it comes from people that you can't identify.
Mike, how much does irresponsible journalism, which may or may not result, as Linda said, in biased reporting, how much of that is to blame for putting journalists, if you like, in the front line and making them a target for people who have a grudge?
Well, I think that there is a lot of understandable anger and frustration at the public broadcasting service in this country, particularly BBC Scotland, and the experience of people throughout the referendum. So there is understandable, but I think it's also true that the independence movement has to hold itself to a higher account. And I think at a certain point, people got confused that the more angry you were in expressing yourself, the more radical you were somehow, or that there was an effective way of solving that problem. And it clearly wasn't into abuse. And there is clearly a misogynist element to it. And I think although Sarah Smith's comments may have been slightly stage managed and exited, I think what she was entirely credible, and I think that she was, exposed to some pretty horrendous abuse. I don't think that's okay. I don't think it's defendable, and I don't think that the Yes movement has quite got it right in saying, do you know what? Just being angry isn't being radical. They're not the same things.
But then, I mean, we've been kind of talking all morning about, standards and people maintaining standards. And yes, I would agree that any political movement has to hold itself to higher account and has to have the moral high ground. But then so does journalism. So I also read the same article by Andrew Neil that Linda was talking about this morning. And I didn't pick up on what he said about American politics. What I did pick up on was he talked about the toxic cesspit of Scottish politics. He blamed the SNP, not the wider movement. And he said that they encouraged people to gang up on anyone who doesn't drink the SNP Kool-Aid. Now, not only is that offensive, it's also suggesting that the SNP are not a popular party of government, and the polls would suggest that that is not in fact the case. So it's also quite disingenuous. So that's the kind of irresponsible journalism. But I now want to turn to a wider set of irresponsible journalism that we're seeing at the moment. There must be a referendum coming because the scare stories have happened again. Yes, pensions are going to be stolen from old ladies. We're going to lose billions to the Scottish economy. There is going to be a surge of businesses moving out of Scotland. There'll be no Ministry of Defence contracts in Scotland. Excuse me, I know, stop me if you've heard it before. And while we can dismiss a lot of that as panic and scaremongering, I have to say, Mike, I adored the cartoon that you tweeted the other day, which was the Schrodinger's cat of unionist media. Would you, for anyone who didn't see it, could you just explain what that was? I retweeted it this morning. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, well, it was the idea that a lot of the unionist commentariat sort of say there will never be another referendum. There should never be another referendum. It's not in your power. It's not going to happen. They're lying to you, but at the same time are obsessed with the fact that there's going to be another referendum. And in the last 2 weeks, you've seen an extraordinary outpouring of Project Fear 2, really, and there's a great sense of deja vu with a lot of these stories. One of the worst of them was Kenny Ferguson from the Times writing a piece which imagined kind of Scottish nationalist terrorism in the future, and this is a bit of a thread that's been picked up by a few people. That the kind of narrative is, as you said about Andrew Neil, politics is this toxic cesspit. It's brimming with violence and threat, and it's completely overblown. And as I tried to put to Kenny Farquharson, it also ignores the reality of British nationalist violence, whether it was the death, the murder of Joe Cox by an avowed British nationalist, or if it was British nationalist and loyalist mobs on the streets of Glasgow. So it's extraordinary kind of imagining of Scottish nationalism as a violent terrorist movement, whilst at the same time ignoring the actual reality of British nationalism and its violence. So that is an extraordinary narrative that's being painted for the public.
And it's a dangerous narrative, Linda, surely.
Yes, it's absolutely a dangerous narrative. I mean, I don't believe Scottish politics is any more divisive than politics elsewhere in the UK or beyond. In fact, it's a lot more democratic and it's a lot more civic than in many places that we've talked about today, let alone other places that we haven't mentioned. It's an establishment closing together thing, we all know that. It's the tactics of fear. I mean, they even called it Project Fear last time around. You know, and I remember, was it Alan Cochrane, the journalist? If I'm misquoting him, I'll apologise in advance, but I think it was him that in his book actually boasted about the propaganda that was used by
Yeah,
the Unionist press. Was it Alan Cochrane?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Boasted about the propaganda that was put out there by the Unionist press and what a good job it did. You know, and when you think about it, the Unionist press are the mainstream press, apart from, you know, the great stuff we've got online in so many fora, and indeed one national newspaper and a couple of small publications. So they band together in the self-interest that they have, and they have absolutely no compunction about pumping out all that propaganda. And it is propaganda. Yes, every side in a political debate has got its angry people, you know, as Mike talked about. Some of it's manufactured and some of it's deliberate. And I have seen it firsthand, some of the unions' manufactured anger. And during the referendum, I get a bit of abuse, totally unjustified. But nobody was talking about that in the mainstream press. All we were talking about was so-called abuse by independistas, you know. Well, a lot of us were getting it from the other side as well, and nobody was reporting that because it didn't suit the propaganda message. And yes, it is dangerous. It's as dangerous as that blooming Boris Johnson standing up and doing what he did to Keir Starmer. You know,
Yeah, well, that's a good
it's
point. Back to
horrible.
abuse. There was state-sponsored
Yeah,
abuse where the Prime Minister
yeah.
just makes an accusation about someone's former job and says, you were personally responsible for Jimmy Savile, and he got away with that. Mike, this Kenny Farquharson piece was written supposedly in response to an overseas correspondent asking him, would there be violence? As if he's suggesting not his own idea. And I was quite interested in that. There is certainly across Europe in particular a bit of a misunderstanding about Scottish nationalism. I remember when the SNP came to power, when they were able to announce that they were going to have a referendum, and they got their overall majority, which of course was unique. And I can remember a lot of European colleagues only hearing that it was a nationalist party getting in touch and saying, oh, I'm so sorry to hear this. How awful for you. Assuming
Yeah.
that it was nationalism as it is understood, or more widely understood in Europe, that it is right-wing nationalism. And certainly that's what English nationalism is. Let's face it, it has a right-wing hue to it, or maybe even more than a hue. So there is a possibility. Surely this was, if we were talking about responsible journalism, this was an opportunity for him, because he knows full well the differences between the two, to say, no, there is a different attitude to nationalism in Scotland on the whole. And yes, there are people who have extreme views on both sides of the debate. But this would have been an opportunity to change that narrative rather than go with it. So is he just, jumping to the tune of his paymasters, or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think he's what I'd call an orphan centrist who doesn't really know what to do with the new political reality, and is certainly playing to the readership of the Times. I mean, if you looked at the comments underneath that article, they're extraordinary sort of bile and hatred against Nicola Sturgeon, against the SNP, and against the independence movement. So I think it's clickbait to his audience. But I think it was a disingenuous and dishonest article he wrote, because he knows fine well that it was a misrepresentation of the movement here. I think in terms of what you're saying of Europe perceiving a nationalist movement as being of the right, I mean, I've for a long time said that the Yes movement should redefine itself as a democracy movement rather than a nationalist movement. I think we we thought we needed a parliament, but actually what we needed was a democracy. And I think if you look at it as a movement for democracy, it does change the tone of demands, and it does change the appeal and stop the problem of being defined as a nationalist, capital N movement.
So actually what you're saying is we don't need propaganda to counter it. What we need is a much stronger message and vision. But Linda's also made the point that getting that out and reported is a difficult thing. So there needs to be a plan for that, Mike, yes?
Yeah, I think there needs to be an emboldened reset of the proposition, and I think it should include saying that we're going to a Scottish Republic. I think it should include a constitutional vision that is contemporary and about democracy in opposition and contrast to the British state, which is clearly centralised and anti-democratic, in some ways still feudal. So I think we need to completely reset the Yes movement, define it as a democracy movement, and begin to paint a picture rather than just, as Project Fear is, repeat the arguments from 2014. I think we need a new set of arguments.
Well, on that very positive note, and that certainly sounds like the arguments that were made on the run-up to 2014 that I think maybe for various reasons have been lost. That's all we've got time for. A couple of themes have run through today's programme. The power of chaos, whether it's chaos at home by a chaotic Prime Minister or chaos abroad by a malignant and malevolent manipulating autocrat. And also the problems with mainstream media and propaganda. So today, you've not just had the benefit of independent broadcasting, you've also had the benefit of independent print journalism through Mike Small here with Bella Caledonia. What better advert can you have for making sure that independent journalism is prepared to put that alternative vision forward than signing up to www.broadcasting.co.scot/register and make a regular donation to keep the station going and to help us develop and promote all the sorts of interesting work we're going to put out in the public domain between now and whenever the next referendum happens. So thank you very much to both Linda and Mike for joining me today. It's been a good programme. I shall see you in the midweek, one of the midweek shows. In the meantime, please everyone, have a nice Sunday. Thank you and goodbye.